help me understand day to day at a high level. What are the 5 rituals that you recommend?
Yeah. Well, I should preface it by saying the question that I asked myself was because if you're like me in terms of like never having enough time, as entrepreneurs, as salespeople, you ask yourself, well, what would you do if you had an extra day, right? So what would you do if you had a day 8? What would that day look like, right? Because this comes back to the whole, how would I show up? What can I do to show up every day and have success and have energy? And that's an elusive target because there are so many things going on. So the reframe out of the gate is, what would I do if I didn't have all these things that I had to do, so to speak? Because often that is the challenge. Is if you think about the prioritization matrix in terms of the urgent critical, quadrant 1 is where most of us live, and we think we have to live there. If you do a deeper analysis, or at least I found this, is those things that I thought were urgent and critical, well, they might have been urgent, but they weren't critical. They might have been critical for somebody else. Oftentimes we can take on, other people's critical without realizing that. We got to be really, ruthless with our time as entrepreneurs, and as much as possible get into that quadrant 2. So that's like the non-urgent but critical work. That's like getting your doctor's appointment. That's like brushing your teeth. You know what I mean? That's like going for a walk. It's getting exercise. It's doing your taxes. It's all the things that you put off and you don't want to do. And that's why I say, well, what would you like? What about day 8? So you cannot do. There's no emergencies. There's nothing. What are those things that you would do? So that's the reframe first. And I wanted to do that before I, kind of went through my routine. Because people might say, well, that's easy for you because you don't have X, Y, Z. And that's true. I do not live in the world of any of the other listeners. And that old adage is, if everybody threw their problems into a big pile in the middle, they'd quickly grab their own problems first. So this is not to discount that people would have real objections to what I'm about to say, but it is because it's so simple that, I anticipate the objections. And the fact is there are these truths. There's, an ideal time of day, biologically speaking, to sleep and to be awake. And we know this is true in terms of the negative health effects associated with people who work night shifts, right? Or who toggle back and forth, or who pull all-nighters. So that's a real basic one, is get into the light and dark cycle of wherever you are in the world. So I don't want to give times, because if you're in Norway, this isn't going to apply to you. If you're at the equator, this won't apply for you. So, there's a ton of like circadian apps out there just to, understand the natural rhythm of the day. And that was really where this work came from. Is like, I really quantified my natural rhythm throughout the day. And I noticed there were, 2 peaks in my day, as measured by my heart rate variability. And for the biohackers listening, that if your heart rate variability is high, that's your readiness, your ability to be, your adaptiveness, if you will, your ability to be versatile, to kind of take anything and perform. If that's low, that's when you're getting into burnout and fatigue. But even when it's low, you'll notice there are these peaks and troughs throughout the day. So the place where I put my rituals actually is in the troughs, right? So if I go to thinking about, when I wake up. So the first thing that I'm doing, as I'm waking up is, first of all, I'm waking up at the same time every day, right? And the only reason that I can do that actually is because of the night before, is my PM before bed ritual. So maybe I'll start with that trough. So that's a really simple one. It's looking at my calendar. So this is the last thing that I'm doing at the end of the day, is I'm looking at my calendar, and It actually, this is a good trick for you, Colin, because what we said at the beginning of this call, you're like, oh my God, if Google Calendar went down, what would I do? Well, I go through all my digital calendars, and then I actually transform it into like analog. So I actually map out my day and analyze something that in that 5 minutes of writing out what I'm going to do, it's like setting my subconscious mind to work over the night. So it's like, I already know what the priorities are for the next day. And that's powerful. And then once I'm done that, I'll move into, some form of, uplifting reading. It could be philosophical, it could be scripture, it's just something ancient, something, outside of the noise, like definitely not social media, definitely not digital. I mean, I'm literally reading bedtime stories, of ancient minds of past, so to speak. So that really connects you to something bigger than yourself, before you're going to bed. And there are other things that I do, let's just say biologically as well. An Epsom salt bath, if you're having trouble sleeping, that's gold. So a hot Epsom salt bath, a little bit of magnesium with water, and, melatonin if you're coming off some travel. And I start that wind down ritual about an hour before I'm going to bed. So that's the key, right? Is like, don't hurry up and go to bed. And maybe even start this 2 hours before you go to bed. You start to plan for the next day. So let's just say that's ritual one, but it's starting at the end of the day, right? And
Okay.
And then in the morning, ritual two is really just picking up where I left off. Is I start by reading something of meaning, right? So again, I'm not checking LinkedIn as my first thing, or social media, or tapping in, because I'm waking up well in advance to everybody else. Like, I like to wake up typically 4 hours before the workday starts, like at least, so that I can really ease into it, right? So then I'll start, again, reading some uplifting content that I've set out the night before. So, this is important to have a library, build out like a whole curriculum of things you want to read in your life. So you just pick them up because they're there. You don't have to, you don't have to let Netflix tell you what you like, so to speak. You can have your own library. Yeah. So yeah, it's starting the day with, reading that uplifting content, and then I'll go through and I'll look at what's the day that I have planned, and which I had just done the night before. And I'll spend a couple minutes doing that, and I'll have like me personally, I'll throw coffee, put like a little bit of honey, and some collagen and butter in there. It's like a zone ratio, so I don't spike my sugar, but I get a little bit of a caffeine boost. I'm a slow metabolizer of caffeine, but because I do this before my workout, it's actually great. It gives me a cognitive boost for me to think about what I'm going to do that day, and then I go do my physical routine, because I solve problems with moving, right? So I was one of those kids who, if I went to school today, I would definitely be on, ADD medication, because I move to think. It's just, that's what works for me. So then I'll come back. And so that's my second ritual, my workout. And then the third ritual is the startup ritual, right? So the startup ritual is me going to my quadrant 2 planner, right? So the things that are non-urgent but critical. And I do 3 of those things first, before I get to anything else in my day. And what's really cool is, because I know how all these urgent things coming up, the mind is just solving a lot of those problems, before you even get to the meat and potatoes of your day, right? Like the 8 calls that you have, for example. You can just kind of, show up because you've reviewed all these things already. And if you've done a good job curating the calls, you're probably bringing in people who are, awesome and synergistic, right? So it's not just about you having to do all the work. It's about leaving room for space to explore those synergies with people. It's like this call. I have no idea where this call is going. I'm reliant on you, or us, to come together and build that. So that's 3. Real simple. Is just basically, doing those first 3 things. Today, for example, my 3 things were looking at my own personal responsibility operating system, deciding on a life insurance plan with my wife, and going over our birth plan because we have a baby due in 2 weeks, right? So all that before my day starts. It's like, I'm like, wow, like I'm rocking it, right? Because I've taken care of myself, taken care of people I love. And now I can get to work with that energy. And then of course, now you're in it, right? Now you're taking calls, get back to people, doing like your massive action lists. And, you know, I'm basically hitting that from like 8 to 12, 12:30. And then middle of the day, that's again, now time that I reserve for physical activity. You don't have to be doing anything crazy. Just go for a walk, break it up, do some yoga, stretch. I mean, the great thing about working at home, great thing about being an entrepreneur or salesperson is you potentially own your own schedule. So as long as you start to plan these non-negotiable little anchors in your day and you start to get into the habit of planning around them, this kind of just starts to take form on its own. So then, you know, so that ritual period is anywhere from 30 minutes to 90 minutes, depending on what my day will allow. And then I'm basically heads down from, you know, 1:30 to 6. And then in the last half hour, I'm basically, you know, going through my day that I had set up. So I basically have a system of, well, here are all the, you know, the initiative, the action items that are running that are all tied to highly specific initiatives that I planned. Well, what was the insight, and then what was the next action item from them? And then I set those up, you know, for the next day, the next week, etc. So this, like, as I mentioned from the beginning, it sounds, you know, all very fine and good for me. You know, I've spent, you know, 10 years trying to figure this out, but I did it by starting with that notion of, well, what would I do if I had an extra day, day 8? And then what I do is I measure the day against that day 8 every day to say, okay, well, how close was I to that perfect day in terms of how I want to live my day? And what I find is the more consistent I am with my anchors, the more surprises that I get that I couldn't have planned for. And so the irony of this planning is it allows me to be incredibly spontaneous, which, you know, on the whole, if I evaluate myself against that day 8, if I say I'm doing 51%, that's pretty darn good, right? Because I'm leaving room for serendipity, for spontaneity. So it's not about being tyrannical over yourself and subjecting yourself to these crazy, you know, rituals per se. It's about, you know, each entrepreneur finding their own operating system. And that's one of the things that I help people get to as a coach, because you would know, I'm sure this phrase sounds familiar to you. The answers are inside of you already. So it's really, you know, how do we help people, you know, get to what they already know, you know, as coaches. So